At 9:40 in the morning on July 25th, 1944, General Fritz Bayerlein stood at his field headquarters 2 miles south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road in Normandy. He watched the sky fill with American bombers. The summer air was warm. The morning had dawned clear after days of rain and overcast that had delayed the attack everyone knew was coming. French farmland stretched around him, divided by ancient hedgerows that had turned this campaign into a grinding nightmare for attackers and defenders alike. Somewhere to the north, American infantry waited in their foxholes for the signal to advance. Bayerlein was 45 years old, the commander of Germany's elite Panzer Lehr Division, which he had led for 6 months. Before that, he had served as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's chief of staff in North Africa, standing beside the Desert Fox through the victories at Gazala and Tobruk and the defeat at El Alamein. He had later commanded the 3rd Panzer Division on the Eastern Front, where he led a breakout from Soviet encirclement at Kirovograd against Hitler's orders. He had faced British tanks at El Alamein, American infantry in Tunisia, and Soviet T-34s at Kursk. In 27 years of military service, Fritz Bayerlein had witnessed nearly every form of combat the 20th century could produce. He had survived desert warfare, Arctic cold, artillery barrages, and air attacks. He carried wounds from multiple campaigns and wore the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, one of Germany's highest decorations for valor. But Bayerlein had never seen anything like what was coming toward him now. In front of his eyes, 1,500 heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, stretched from horizon to horizon. Behind them came another 1,000 medium bombers and fighter bombers. In total, nearly 3,000 Allied aircraft were converging overhead, carrying more than 4,000 tons of high explosives and napalm. All of it was aimed at a rectangle of Norman countryside, roughly 6 kilometers long and 2 kilometers wide. Bayerlein's division sat directly in the center of that rectangle. What would happen in the next 96 hours would transform Panzer Lehr, the most elite armored formation in the German Wehrmacht, from a feared fighting force into scattered wreckage. It would kill or wound over 70% of the men under Bayerlein's command. It would mark the moment when Germany lost control of France forever. And it would all begin with bombs falling like rain from a clear summer sky. Panzer Lehr Division, activated in December 1943, was unique from the start. It was formed from the instructors and demonstration troops of Germany's premier tank training schools. These men were experts who had literally written the book on armored warfare. They knew the equipment intimately and had taught its tactics to thousands of others. Hitler ordered Panzer Lehr's formation during the crisis of late 1943, as Germany braced for an Allied invasion in the West. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of Germany's Panzer Arm, oversaw the process. Panzer Lehr was designed to be a model unit, lavishly equipped and filled with the best trained men Germany could muster. When the division assembled in the Nancy-Verdun area of France in early 1944, it was extraordinary by any measure. Unlike a standard panzer division, where most infantry rode in unarmored trucks, vulnerable to every shell fragment and stray bullet, every panzer grenadier in Panzer Lehr rode in an armored half-track. The division had 674 half-tracks, more than twice the number found in any other German division. This meant Panzer Lehr's infantry could keep up with the tanks, and even fight from their vehicles, advancing under fire that would have pinned down ordinary troops. By June 1944, Panzer Lehr fielded over 200 tanks, around 97 Panzer Y4s, and 86 Panthers. The division also deployed Jagdpanzer IV tank destroyers, and even some of the new 8-wheeled Puma armored cars for reconnaissance. Uniquely, even its artillery was fully motorized, able to keep up with the tanks. But equipment alone didn't make Panzer Lehr special. The men of the division were seasoned veterans with unmatched experience. About 60% of the troops were veterans of the Eastern Front, or North Africa, including many decorated survivors of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Tunisia. Most of the officers and NCOs had served as instructors at the panzer schools, so they understood armored warfare at a level few could match. They had taught tactics for years and were now applying that expertise in the field. These troops were not ordinary soldiers. They even wore distinctive double-breasted field jackets, like those of assault gun crews, to set them apart. They were young, average age only 21, but exceptionally experienced and carefully selected. This rare combination of youth and veteran skill made Panzer Lehr a uniquely formidable force. By June 1944, when Allied forces invaded Normandy, Panzer Lehr numbered over 14,000 officers and men, making it the strongest German armored division. Rommel called it the finest panzer division in the West. The only glaring weakness, some officers noted, was that Panzer Lehr concentrated so much of Germany's elite tank leadership in one unit. If it were destroyed, Germany would lose not just a division, but an entire generation of armored warfare expertise. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, Panzer Lehr was positioned near Chartres, about 150 kilometers from the beaches, as part of the Strategic Armored Reserve. But Hitler delayed committing his armor. Convinced the Normandy landings might be a feint, he initially kept Panzer Lehr and other reserves pinned near Calais. Hours were wasted. Not until late on June 6th, D-Day itself, or early on June 7th, did Panzer Lehr finally receive orders to move toward Normandy, precious time that allowed the Allies to dig in and reinforce. As Panzer Lehr finally moved out, Allied air power made the journey a nightmare. Moving by day was impossible under constant attack from roving RAF Typhoons and US P-47 Thunderbolts, so Bayerlein shifted to night marches. Even darkness offered only partial protection. The roads were clogged with traffic, and Allied planes still prowled using flares and radar. By the time Panzer Lehr reached the front on June 8th, it had lost dozens of vehicles and even a few tanks simply in transit, knocked out by air attacks. Panzer Lehr went into action immediately against British forces near Caen. There was no time to rest or plan a coordinated attack. The German front was under extreme pressure and needed plugging. For the next 7 weeks, the division fought continuously with virtually no reinforcements. Normandy's Bocage country was a defender's paradise. Small fields enclosed by centuries-old earthen hedgerows thick with vegetation. These natural walls funneled attackers into predictable paths and concealed deadly ambushes. Tanks couldn't crash through hedgerows without exposing their weak underside, so they were forced into gaps and narrow lanes, obvious kill zones. Every hedge and sunken lane could hide an anti-tank gun or a squad with a bazooka. A commander might see only peaceful green in front of him one moment and lose his tank to a hidden enemy at point-blank range the next. In such terrain, the Germans' long-range gunnery advantage was nullified. Battles were won by reflexes, cunning, and sometimes sheer luck. On June 13th, the British 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, attempted to outflank Panzer Lehr by seizing the village of Villers-Bocage. They were met by one of the war's most renowned tank aces, SS officer Michael Wittmann, commanding a single Tiger one-arm heavy tank. Wittmann ambushed the British column and, in a matter of minutes, destroyed a dozen or more of their tanks along with many other vehicles, forcing the British to withdraw from Villers-Bocage. This dramatic action became legendary, but even such victories only slowed the Allies briefly while Panzer Lehr's own strength continued to erode. The fighting around Caen and the neighboring town of Tilly-sur-Seulles dragged on through late June. By the end of June, Panzer Lehr had taken nearly 3,000 casualties and lost dozens of its tanks, plus hundreds of vehicles. The once proud division was being steadily ground down. In early July, as the British and Canadians kept up attacks near Caen, the American First Army was fighting to capture Saint-Lô. On July 7th, Panzer Lehr was pulled out of the Caen sector and rushed west to bolster the defense around Saint-Lô. Bayerlein's weary men found themselves in even denser bocage against a fresh American onslaught. On July 10th, Bayerlein tried to counterattack near a village ironically named Le Désert. It was a disaster. Allied tank destroyers and fighter bombers pounced on his forces in the open, and roughly 30 Panzer Lehr tanks were knocked out in a single day. The survivors fled back across the Weir River, with the Americans in pursuit. For the next 2 weeks, Panzer Lehr held on desperately as the Americans inched forward. Every day brought more losses of men, tanks, and ground. Saint-Lô fell on July 18, 19, after days of savage fighting. Bayerlein knew the Allies were primed to burst out of the Bocage any day, and Panzer Lehr was directly in the path of the coming blow. What he did not know was how huge that blow would be. By mid-July, the Allies were growing frustrated with the slow, bloody progress in Normandy. Over 1 million Allied troops were ashore, but they were still wedged in a cramped bridgehead about 50 miles wide and 20 miles deep. Casualties were mounting, and the front lines had scarcely moved in weeks. Some compared it to World War I trench warfare. A decisive breakout was needed. The British and Canadians had launched their own offensives around Caen, Operations Epsom, Charnwood, Goodwood, but despite heavy fighting and losses, they hadn't achieved a breakout. Now General Omar Bradley, commanding the U.S. First Army, was ready to attempt an American breakout operation codenamed Cobra. His idea was simple and bold: concentrate overwhelming force on a single narrow front. He would use a massive aerial bombardment to pulverize a gap in the German line, then send armored divisions surging through before the enemy could recover. Speed and shock would replace the grinding war of attrition. Major General J. Lawton Lightning Joe Collins was tapped to lead the assault. Collins had earned his nickname for aggressive leadership and had recently shown his skill by seizing the port of Cherbourg. Bradley trusted that Collins would push forward relentlessly and exploit any opening Cobra created. Bradley chose sectors south of Saint-Lô along the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road as the target for Cobra. That happened to be the sector held by Panzer Lehr Division. This was no accident. Bradley knew Panzer Lehr was one of only 2 panzer divisions facing the Americans. If he could smash Panzer Lehr, the Germans would have no armored reserve left on the U.S. front to stop a breakout. The scale of bombardment for Cobra was unprecedented. Bradley even went to England to personally request the use of heavy strategic bombers in a tactical role. He wanted nothing less than to blast a highway through the German defenses. Through late July, poor weather delayed Cobra. Low clouds and rain made it unsafe for mass bombers to operate near friendly lines. Finally, on July 24th, the skies cleared enough to try. That morning, about 1,600 Allied planes took off. Hundreds of heavy bombers droned toward Normandy, while swarms of medium bombers and fighter bombers armed with rockets and napalm streaked ahead of them. On July 24th, poor visibility caused the first planned bombardment to be aborted at the last minute. Not every bomber got the recall message. Some dropped their bombs short onto the waiting American troops. Tragically, 25 American soldiers were killed and about 130 wounded by friendly bombs that day, before the main attack had even begun. Bradley was furious, having wanted the bombers to approach from a safer angle, but with the Germans now alerted that something big was coming, he had to launch Cobra the next day regardless of the risk. Bayerlein spent the night of July 24th at his command post near Cannassy, just behind Panzer Lehr's sector. He knew a major American attack was imminent. German intelligence had picked up telltale radio traffic, but he didn't know exactly when or where it would hit. He had around 3,200 combat troops positioned along the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road, backed by perhaps 45 operational tanks and assault guns, many of them in need of repair. That was a fraction of the division's original strength. July 25th, 1944, dawned bright and clear. Just before H hour, American infantry quietly pulled back about 1,000 yards from the front line and hunkered down to avoid being caught in the coming storm. The signal to hell came at 9:38. Wave after wave of fighter bombers suddenly screamed in at low level. Roughly 600 British Typhoons and American P-47 Thunderbolts strafed and rocketed German frontline positions along a narrow strip focusing on strong points, gun emplacements, and anything that looked like a headquarters. For 20 minutes, they worked over the German line. Then they peeled away. Moments later, the earth began to shake. The heavy bombers had arrived. 800 B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators appeared overhead in precise formation, stretching across the sky. They came in successive waves, and as they reached the target zone, they opened their bomb bay doors. What followed was apocalyptic. The target area was about 6,000 yards wide by 2,900 yards deep, roughly 12 square kilometers. Into this box, the heavy bombers dropped approximately 3,300 tons of bombs in the space of just over an hour. Bayerlein later said, "The bombers came as if on a conveyor belt. Back and forth, carpets were laid." The bombing was methodical and merciless, and it didn't end there. Hundreds of medium bombers and fighter bombers joined in, adding hundreds more tons of explosives and napalm to the inferno. Meanwhile, American artillery, hundreds of guns massed for Cobra, began shelling the same area in a coordinated barrage. The din was beyond description. Imagine 3,000 aircraft raining destruction in relays, and hundreds of cannons on the ground adding their chorus. The physical destruction was almost beyond comprehension. Roughly 60,000 bombs were dropped. Fields and villages disappeared. The village of La Chapelle-en-Juger, right in Panzer Lehr's sector, was literally wiped off the map, reduced to craters and ashes. Other hamlets were similarly obliterated or left as heaps of burning rubble. The landscape that had been peaceful Norman farmland an hour earlier now looked like the moon. For the men of Panzer Lehr caught in this hell, there was no escape. Every semblance of organized defense was instantly torn apart. Communications lines were cut, command posts obliterated. Bayerlein later wrote, "All signal communications were cut and no command was possible. Trenches and dugouts collapsed on those inside. Tanks were flipped over or blown to pieces where they stood. Horses and men were vaporized or shredded. Shock waves from the blasts swept through every shelter. The psychological impact was just as devastating. Indescribable shock engulfed those who survived the initial blasts. Some German soldiers simply went mad under the bombardment. Witnesses later recalled seeing men emerge from bunkers during the raid, staggering and screaming, only to be killed by the next explosion. Others curled into a daze, deafened and unable to process what was happening. Bayerlein estimated that over 70% of his division's troops in the bombardment zone were dead, wounded, or too shell-shocked to fight. About 1,000 of his men likely died in that single hour. Hundreds more were wounded. Panzer Lehr's fighting ability was virtually annihilated in one blow. The division's tanks and guns fared little better. Near misses from 500-pound bombs could break a Panther's tracks or rip its turret clean off. Many of Panzer Lehr's armored vehicles were knocked out, buried, or disabled without firing a shot. When the smoke began to clear, Bayerlein had perhaps half a dozen tanks still operational in the core of his sector. Yet, incredibly, pockets of German survivors emerged from the rubble, and these were no ordinary troops. Many were Panzer Lehr's veteran instructors, tough and disciplined. They dug out a few anti-tank guns that were still operable and rallied any men they could find. A handful of reserve tanks that had been outside the worst of the bombardment also moved in. These remnants formed ad hoc battle groups, determined to exact a price for every yard the enemy advanced. The bombardment itself turned the landscape into an obstacle course. Giant craters and debris-strewn fields made it tough for American tanks and vehicles to advance. Roads had vanished. This unexpected terrain havoc actually slowed the U.S. attack, giving the dazed German survivors a little more time to recover and resist. Tragically, the American bombardment did not spare their own men. Despite careful planning, many bombers on July the 25th still approached from the north, perpendicular to the front, and the drifting smoke led some to release bombs short. Friendly bombs fell among the U.S. lines again. This time, approximately 111 American soldiers were killed and nearly 500 wounded in the blunder. One of the casualties was Lieutenant General Lesley McNair. McNair had come over from England to observe the operation and to play a role in a deception plan. At 61, he was one of the most important figures in the U.S. Army, responsible for training and organizing American ground forces. On the morning of the 25th, McNair was crouching in a foxhole with soldiers of the 30th Division right in front of the bombardment zone when the errant bombs rained down. He was killed instantly by a direct hit. McNair became the highest-ranking American officer lost in combat in World War II. His death was kept secret for a time to avoid alerting the enemy to his presence in Normandy. Also caught in the inferno was famed war correspondent Ernie Pyle. Pyle, age 43, had earned the trust of ordinary GIs with his vivid, compassionate newspaper columns about frontline life. He was with the U.S. 4th Infantry Division on July 25th, watching the bombardment from what should have been a safe distance. At first, Pyle and the GIs around him were awestruck. The entire sky was filled with Allied bombers, and the ground ahead was erupting in sheets of fire and smoke. It was an overwhelming spectacle of American might, and for a moment they forgot their own danger. Then, reality set in. They noticed each successive wave of bombers was dropping its payload slightly closer to their own lines. The carpet of explosions was creeping toward them. An indescribable kind of panic comes over you, Pyle wrote. The men felt trapped and helpless as the bombing inched back in their direction. Suddenly, the bombs began falling on the American positions. Pyle threw himself into a ditch and squirmed under a wagon as the world turned into thunder and hellfire around him. He felt continuous concussions flutter his eardrums and pummel his chest. Men nearby were torn apart by shrapnel. Pyle miraculously survived unhurt, but he called it the most terrible thing ever that he had experienced. The ordeal left Pyle badly shaken. In the weeks afterward, he admitted in his columns that he had begun to lose track of the war's purpose amid so much carnage, and feared that if he saw one more dead man, he might go insane. Even so, he continued doing his duty, following the soldiers, sharing their foxholes, and writing their stories as best he could. At 11:00 a.m., once the bombing lifted, the U.S. 9th and 30th Infantry Divisions began moving forward. What they found was nightmarish. The ground was churned beyond recognition, dotted with craters and smoldering wreckage. In theory, there should have been little resistance. The bombardment was meant to wipe it out. In reality, small pockets of German resistance were still alive and fighting. Initially, some American units advanced with almost no opposition, picking their way through stunned survivors who surrendered readily. But elsewhere, American troops were suddenly met with machine gun and rifle fire from the ruins. Here and there, a German anti-tank gun, miraculously intact, cracked off shots at advancing U.S. tanks, or a surviving Panther from outside the bomb zone appeared and fired a few rounds. These were isolated actions, but they had to be dealt with one by one. Every hedgerow, every bit of high ground had to be secured. By the end of July 25th, Collins's 7th Corps had advanced only about 2,000 yards, just over a mile. It was less progress than many had hoped. Some American commanders were disappointed. After such an immense bombardment, they expected to slice right through. But on the German side, there were no signs of an organized counterattack or coherent defensive line. It became clear that while shattered remnants were still resisting, the front had essentially been broken. The reports from German prisoners confirmed the devastation. They spoke in bewildered, shell-shocked tones of entire units being blown off the earth. Many of them were so demoralized and disoriented that they barely understood what was happening. Bradley and Collins realized that although progress on the map looked slow, the door was open. The German defense in this sector had been effectively destroyed. That night, July 25th, Collins made a crucial decision. Despite the patchy resistance still ongoing, he ordered his armored divisions to exploit the breach at first light on July 26th, rather than waiting for a perfectly secured gap. This went against cautious doctrine. Tanks rushing ahead without infantry support could be vulnerable. But Collins sensed the Germans were too shattered to organize any effective defense. Every hour's delay was an opportunity for the enemy to regroup, and he wasn't going to give them that chance. In his words, "We've got to use our armor and go now." At dawn on July 26th, the U.S. 3rd Armored Division and 2nd Armored Division rolled forward through the Cobra corridor. They encountered only scattered resistance, mostly bypassing or overrunning the few German strongpoints left. By the evening of July 26th, American armored spearheads had punched deep into the German rear. One U.S. reconnaissance column even roared past General Bayerlein's own command post. He watched, stunned, as American half-tracks and armored cars sped down a road that had been, until hours earlier, securely behind the German front. The breach was now undeniable. By July 27th, the breakthrough had become a rout. U.S. tanks and infantry fanned out across the countryside, seizing one village after another. German units were disintegrating. Any reserves hastily thrown in were caught on the roads by Allied fighter bombers and shredded before they could even get into the fight. By day's end, multiple ruptures existed across the German front, and there was no hope of re-establishing a coherent line. On July 28th, American forces captured Coutances on the coast, cutting off many German units in western Normandy. German columns trying to retreat east were pounded mercilessly by U.S. artillery and airstrikes. In one such strike near La Chapelle-en-Jugé, an entire mixed column of armor and vehicles from various German units was practically obliterated by point-blank artillery fire and rocket-firing planes. The carnage was unimaginable. By the end of that day, Bayerlein reported that Panzer Lehr Division was annihilated. Its armor was gone, its infantry either casualties or scattered, and its headquarters records destroyed. The division that entered Normandy 7 weeks earlier with over 14,000 men and 200 tanks had ceased to exist. In the aftermath of Cobra, Hitler ordered a counterattack at Mortain in early August, but it failed disastrously. The German 7th Army ended up encircled and largely destroyed in the Falaise pocket by mid-August. Paris was liberated on August 25th. The German position in France had collapsed. The destruction of Panzer Lehr in those 96 hours of Operation Cobra was more than just a local defeat. It was the loss of irreplaceable human capital for the German army. The instructors and veteran leaders who formed the core of Panzer Lehr were dead, wounded, or scattered. Years of accumulated knowledge and experience in armored warfare were wiped out. German officers later lamented that it was a catastrophe from which their armored force never fully recovered. Amazingly, the Germans tried to rebuild Panzer Lehr Division after Normandy. The battered remnants were pulled back to Germany to refit. Over the next couple of months, new recruits and replacement officers were brought in from training depots, and new tanks and vehicles were issued, though never in the lavish numbers of before. By November 1944, Panzer Lehr Division was considered combat-ready again and was thrown into Hitler's last great offensive in the West. The Battle of the Bulge. Bayerlein was still in command, leading Panzer Lehr in the Ardennes offensive of December 1944. The division was part of the drive toward Bastogne during that winter gamble. They fought hard in the snowy forests, but this rebuilt Panzer Lehr was a shadow of the original. The veteran cadres were gone, its ranks now filled with young, hastily trained soldiers. They had enthusiasm, but they lacked the seasoning and finesse that the old instructors had provided. Panzer Lehr in the Bulge fought bravely and inflicted losses on the Allies, but it could not replicate the prowess of its former self. After the failure of the Ardennes offensive, Panzer Lehr, along with the rest of the German army, was in full retreat. In April 1945, General Fritz Bayerlein surrendered to American forces in the Ruhr pocket, along with what was left of his command. He had survived the war. As a prisoner, Bayerlein wrote candid accounts of his wartime experiences for U.S. Army historians, detailing the North African Campaign, the Normandy Campaign, including Cobra and the destruction of Panzer Lehr, and more. These writings became valuable sources for understanding the German side of the war. Bayerlein was released in 1947 and lived quietly in Germany through the post-war years. He died in 1970 at age 71. His obituary noted his service under Rommel in Africa and his command of Panzer Lehr, but naturally it glossed over the grim fate of that elite division on a clear July day in Normandy. The American commanders of Cobra reaped the rewards. General Omar Bradley went on to command the 12th Army Group, the largest U.S. field command ever, as Allied forces drove into Germany. General Lightning Joe Collins led 7 Corps through France, into Belgium and Germany, and later became Army Chief of Staff during the Korean War. Both men earned their 4-star rank and secured their place in military history. Lieutenant General Lesley McNair's death remained officially secret for a time. Today, he lies in the Normandy American Cemetery above Omaha Beach, the highest-ranking American officer buried there. Sadly, Ernie Pyle did not live to see the post-war world. In April 1945, while reporting on the Pacific Front, Pyle was killed by Japanese machine gun fire on the island of Iishima near Okinawa. The 44-year-old journalist's death made headlines back home. President Harry Truman said that no man had told the story of the American fighting man better than Ernie Pyle. Today, Pyle rests at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Hawaii, among thousands of the soldiers whose stories he told. Back in Normandy today, the scars of 1944 have long been covered by green fields and new growth. The bocage that witnessed so much violence has returned to quiet farmland. Bomb craters have been filled in, hedgerows replanted, and villages rebuilt from the ruins. La Chapelle-en-Jugé, once erased in an hour of bombing, has been entirely reconstructed and carries on as a peaceful rural community. To a visitor, there may be little sign of what happened, perhaps a roadside memorial here or there, but the ground remembers. Operation Cobra transformed the war in Western Europe. Before Cobra, the Allies were stuck in a brutal stalemate in Normandy, gaining ground by yards at the cost of thousands of lives. After Cobra, the German front in France collapsed. Allied forces advanced hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. France was liberated. The door to Germany was opened. Cobra was the hammer blow that made it possible. However, Cobra also served as a sobering lesson in the brutal mathematics of war. The same bombardment that wiped out a German division also inadvertently killed over 100 American troops, and even a 3-star general. Bombs do not distinguish friend from foe. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, observing the attack, was so shaken by the friendly fire tragedy that he resolved never again to use heavy strategic bombers so close to ground troops. This is how modern wars are often won, not merely by heroism or brilliant maneuver, but by overwhelming force at the decisive point. In July 1944, the Allies amassed such force against Panzer Lehr Division, and the result was annihilation. The elite German division that had rolled into Normandy confident in its equipment and experience was simply obliterated under an avalanche of bombs and shells. No amount of courage or skill could have withstood that onslaught. The 96-hour nightmare that engulfed Panzer Lehr was a stark demonstration of what total air superiority and industrial might meant on the World War II battlefield. It was brutal, it was effective, and it broke the back of the German defense in Normandy, opening the road to victory in France. If you found this story compelling, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. We'll continue to share powerful stories and forgotten chapters from the Second World War and beyond. Each one matters, and each one deserves to be remembered. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans the globe, and we love hearing your perspective. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.